Good morning, boys and girls. I am here today with a brand new coffee. I just got this yesterday. I'm so excited about it. It's called the Highlander Grog, and I don't know. My daughter said it sounded really good to her. So I have brand new coffee. So I made myself a cup while I'm sitting here reading to you. This is the cup that Hunter got me for Valentine's Day. So thank you, Hunter. So, brand new coffee, brand new book. Okay. Um, this book is great. I love reading it to my students. There's some interesting language, dialect in here, and you'll see it when I start reading. I don't do it very well. But this is a really cool book. And for those of you who, I love reading historical fiction, and not all of you do, but I do love it. And this is a story that takes place in 1940, 30 something. I don't know. It takes place during World War II. And it takes place in a little island. I wish I had a map right here with me. But it takes place in a little island just north of South America. So we have North America up here, we have Mexico here, and down here is South America. So it takes place just a little north of South America, and the island is called Curacao. And I don't know. I think it's part of America, but I'm not really sure. Anyway, but you can see right here, and I know that I introduced this book a little bit to you guys when we kind of were choosing a book to read, and you're like, oh, I want to read this one instead. So, but honestly, this is one of my favorites, and I love to read it, and it has a lot of adventure in it. And there are some interesting characters in this story. We have Timothy, who is a West Indian man. Then we have Philip, who's the main character, and then there's also a cat, which I know that, and his name is Stu Cat. And some of you, Aubrey especially, love kitty cats, and so you're going to relate to this book a lot, especially when it comes to the love of cats. So this is definitely a historical fiction book, and it's not too long. Um, we can see that part of the adventure that's going to take place. It looks to me like this is Timothy and this is Philip, and they are in some deep trouble right there. So we've got some things going on here that are going to be very adventurous and very it's just great. It's just a great story. The beginning of it gives us a lot of background information about what's going on in the world right now. It says 1942. I just found the date. And it's what's happening in the world right now. This island of Curacao has some big oil. They make airplane fuel here at this on this island, and of course, airplane fuel during World War II was super duper important because they used a lot of planes, and they're American, so these were for the American planes. So you can imagine that the Germans and those who were not the allies or the friends of the United States, they wanted to do everything that they could to get rid of this island, because this island created or produced a lot of the airplane oil, and they knew that if they could get rid of the airplane oil, get rid of the island that was producing it, then that would make it really hard for the Americans to have their airplanes flying. So this is it's a really good story. We're gonna let's see, like silent. Okay, I'm gonna start this and then I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna ask you, is this first person or third person? And then how do you know? Okay, so the Cay is what is called a Cay is an island. And so, like I said, this does take place on an island just north of South America, but most of the story takes place in another part of that area, and it takes place on an island, and the island is called a cay. Okay, so a cay is just a small island. So most of the story takes place there. All right, so we're gonna stop. Actually, we're not gonna stop. We're gonna start. And then I will stop though, and I will ask, hey, is this first person or third person? Who do you think's telling the story? Okay. All right. So here we go. Ooh, it's even like the very beginning. The words are like, this author is amazing because he really makes you get a vision of what's going on in the story. So, like silent, hungry sharks that swim in the darkness of the sea, the German submarines arrived in the middle of the night. I was asleep on the second floor of our narrow, gabled greenhouse in Wilmestad on the island of Curacao, the largest of the Dutch islands just off the coast of Venezuela. I remember that on that moonless night in February 1942, they attacked the big Lego oil refinery on Aruba, the sister island west of us. Then they blew up 6 of our small lake tankers, the tubby ones that still bring crude oil from Lake Maracaibo to the refinery. Cay Ch petroleum, and I can't say all these words, to be made into gasoline, kerosene, and diesel oil. One German sub was even sighted off Wilmestad at dawn. All right, so I'm going to stop there and I'm going to ask you, is this written in first person or third person? I want you to think about it. We hear some words in here, and one of those words that we hear is I. I was asleep on the second floor of our narrow gabled greenhouse in Wilmestad. So that tells us that this is written in first person. Who is the narrator of this story, do you think? Well, we don't know his name yet, but we do know that it is someone who's living on this island, and this person is relating what is happening in the world that is around them. So we don't know the person's name yet, but I think we're going to find out really quickly here. So, all right, let me continue. So when I woke up, there was much excitement in the city, which looks like a part of old Holland, except that all the houses are painted in soft colors, pinks and greens and blues, and there are no dikes. Now, I'm not really sure what a dike is, but actually, I'm not really sure what a dike is. I think it might be something that, like a dam that holds back water, but I'm not really sure. We do know, we did find out here because I was curious about whether this story was an American, whether Curacao was an American island, and it's actually not. It was a Dutch island. So Dutch is the Netherlands and that kind of area, which is like near Europe. So, all right. All right, it was very hard to finish my breakfast because I wanted to go to Punda, the business district, the oldest part of town, and then to Fort Amsterdam, where I could look out to the sea. If there was an empty U-boat out there, I wanted to see it and join the people in shaking a fist at it. I was not frightened, just terribly excited. War was something I'd heard a lot about, but had never seen. The whole world was at war, and now it had come to us in the warm blue Caribbean. It's good coffee. The first thing that my mother said was, Philip, the enemy has finally attacked the island, and there will be no school today. But you must stay near home. Do you understand? I nodded. All right, now we're going to stop. Who is telling the story? If you said Philip, you're correct. Okay, Philip. Mom was talking to her son, Philip. So he's a younger kid, probably. I nodded, but I couldn't imagine that a shell from an enemy submarine would pick me out from all the buildings or hit me if I was standing on the famous pontoon bridge or among the ships way back in the Shottegat or along St. Anna Bay. So later in the morning, when she was busy making sure that all our blackout curtains were in place and filling extra pots with fresh water and checking our food supply, I stole away down to the old fort with Henrique van Boven, my Dutch friend, who was also 11. So we just found out a little bit more information about Philip. He's 11 years old, so he's close to your age. He's some of your ages, actually, probably a fifth grader. We also heard a term in here, blackout curtains. And I think in Number the Stars, we talked about blackout curtains, I think. I don't know, maybe not. But we know that at nighttime they needed blackout curtains because the Germans could see their island if they were flying above. And if there were any lights at all on, they would know where to aim their bombs. So they had to have blackout curtains to get rid of all the light so the enemy couldn't see it. All right. All right. I had played there many times with Henrique and other boys when we were a few years younger, imagining we were defending Wilmestad against pirates or even the British. They once stormed the island, I knew long ago. Or sometimes we pretend we were the Dutch going out on raids against Spanish galleons. That had happened too. It was all so real that sometimes we could see the tall, masted ships coming over the horizon. Of course, they were only the tatter-sailed native schooners from Venezuela, Aruba, or Bonaire coming in with bananas and orange, papayas, melons, and vegetables. But to us, they were always pirates. And we'd shout to the noisy black men aboard them. They'd laugh back and they'd go, pow, pow, pow. The fort looks as though it came out of a storybook, with gun ports along the high wall that faces the sea. For years, it guarded Wilmestad, but this one this morning, it did not look like a storybook fort at all. There were real soldiers with rifles, and we saw machine guns. Men with binoculars had them trained toward the white caps, which would be where the ocean is. Because if there's white caps, that means that there's some movement going out on the water, and it could be some enemy ships. And everyone was very tense. They chased us away, telling us to go home. Instead, we went down to the Connigan Emma Brug, the famous Queen Emma pontoon bridge, which spans the channel that leads to the huge harbor, the Shottegat. The bridge is built on floats so it can swing open as ships pass in or out, and it connects Punda with Otrabanda, which means the other side, the other part of the city. The view from there wasn't as good as from the fort, but curious people were there too, just looking. Strangely, no ships were moving in the channel. The veer boats, the ferry boats that shuttled cars and people back and forth, when the bridge was swung open, were tied up and empty. Even the native schooners were quiet against the docks inside the channel, and the black men were not laughing and shouting the way they usually did. Henrique said, "My father told me there's nothing left of Aruba. They hit St. Nicholas, you know." Every lake tanker was sunk, I said. I didn't know if that was true or not, but Henrique had an irritating way of sounding official since his father was connected with the government. His face was round and he was chubby. His hair was straw-colored and his cheeks were always red. Henrique was very serious about everything he said or did. He looked toward Fort Amsterdam. He said, I bet they put the big guns up there now. Well, that was a safe bet. And I said, it won't be long until the Navy's here. Henrique looked at me. Our Navy? He meant the Netherlands Navy. No, I said. Ours, meaning the American Navy, of course. His little navy was scattered all over after the Germans took Holland. Henrique said quietly, our Navy will come too. And I didn't want to argue with him. Everyone felt bad that Holland had been conquered by the Nazis. Then an army officer climbed out of a truck and told us to leave the Queen Emma Bridge. He was very stern and he growled, Don't you know they could shoot a torpedo up here and kill you all? I looked out toward the sea again. It was blue and peaceful, and a good breeze churned it up, making lines of white caps. White clouds drifted slowly over it, but I couldn't see the usual parade of ships coming in toward the harbor. The stubby ones, or the massive ones with flags of many nations that steamed slowly up the bay to the Shottegat to load their gas and their oil. The sea was empty. There was not even a sail on it. We suddenly became frightened and ran home to the Charlus section where we lived. I guess my face was pale when I went into the house because my mother, who was in the kitchen, asked immediately, Where have you been? Punda, I admitted. I went with Henrique. My mother got very upset. She grabbed my shoulder and she shook it. I told you not to go there, Philippe. Philip, she said angrily. We're at war. Don't you understand? We just wanted to see the submarines, I said. My mother closed her eyes and pulled me up against her thin body. She was like that. 1 minute shaking me, the next holding me. The radio was on, and a voice said that 56 men had died on the lake tankers that were blown up, and that the governor of the Netherlands West Indies had appealed to Washington for help. There was no use in asking Amsterdam. I listened to the sorrowful sound of his voice until my mother's hand switched it off. And finally she said, "You'll be safe if you do what we tell you to do. Don't leave the garden again today." She seemed very serious. But then she was often nervous. My mother was always afraid I'd fall off the seawall or tumble out of a tree or cut myself with a pocket knife. Henrique's mother wasn't that way. She laughed a lot and she said, "Oh, boys, boys, boys." Late in the afternoon, my father, whose name was also Philip Enright, returned home from the refinery where he was working on the program to increase production of aviation gas. And we know that aviation means airplane. If you're driving down Interstate 75, you'll see some signs as you're heading toward Dayton, and it says something about birthplace of aviation. And I actually think that might be what's on our license plates. I'm not sure. But aviation means airplanes. And when we're talking about aviation gas, we're talking about the gas for the airplanes. He'd been up since 2 o'clock, my mother said, and please don't ask him too many questions. They had phoned him that morning to say that the Germans might attempt to shell the refinery and the oil storage tanks, and that he must report to help fight the fires. I had never seen him so tired, and I didn't ask as many questions as I wanted to. Until the past year, my father and I had done a lot of things together. Fishing or sailing our small boat or taking long hikes around Krupp Bay or Ciromeo or just going out to the Konoko, which is the countryside, together. We knew a lot about trees and fish and birds. He knew a lot about fish and trees and birds, but now he always seemed busy. Even on Sunday, he'd shake his head and he'd say, "I'm sorry, Guy, I have to work." After he had had his pint of cold Dutch ale, he had one every night in the living room after he came home, I asked, "Will they shoot at us tonight?" He looked at me gravely and answered, "I don't know, Philip. They might. I want you and your mother to sleep down here tonight, not on the second floor. I don't think you're in any danger, but it's better to sleep down here." How many of them are out there? I thought they might be like schools of fish, dozens maybe. I wanted to be able to tell Henrique exactly what my father knew about the submarines. He shook his head. "No one knows, Philip. But there must be 3 of them around the islands. The attacks were in 3 different places." "They came all the way from Germany?" He nodded. "Or from bases in France," he said, loading his pipe. "Well, why can't we go out and fight them?" I asked. My father laughed sadly, and he tapped his long forefinger on my chest. "You'd like that, would you? But we have nothing to fight them with, son. We can't go out in motorboats and attack them with rifles." My mother came in from the kitchen to say, "Stop asking so many silly questions, Philip. I told you not to do that." Father looked at her strangely. He had always answered my questions. "He has a right to know. He's involved here, Grace." My mother looked back at him. "Yes, unfortunately," she said. And we know when we talked in Number the Stars, we talked about, and even in the beginning of Running Out of Time, we talked about how parents didn't tell their kids a lot of things, more just to keep them so they didn't worry and get scared about things. And so him being 11, they probably had in the past not said a lot to Philip about some of the things that were going on. But now as he's getting older, Dad says he has a right to know. So they're trusting him with a little bit more information, knowing that maybe he needs to have a little bit more fear in him to know how serious this is. And those things happened in our other stories that we read. My mother, I knew, had not wanted to come to Curaçao in late 1939, but my father had argued that he was needed for the war effort, even though the United States was not at war then. Royal Dutch Shell had borrowed him from his American company because he was an expert in refineries and gasoline production. But the moment he saw it, my mother decided, the moment she saw it, my mother decided she did not like Curaçao, and she often complained about the smell of gas and oil whenever the trade winds died down. It was very different in Virginia, where my father has been in charge of building a new refinery on the banks of the Elizabeth River. We've lived in a small white house on an acre of land with many trees. My mother often talked about the house and the trees and the change of seasons and the friends she had there. She said it was nice and safe in Virginia. My father would answer quietly, "There's no place nice and safe right now." I remembered the summers with lightning bugs and honeysuckle smells, the cold winters when the fields would all be brown and would crackle under my feet. I didn't remember too much else. I was only 7 when we moved to the Caribbean. I guess my mother was homesick for Virginia, where no one talked Dutch, and there was no smell of gas or oil, and there weren't as many black people around. Now, there was a cold silence between my mother and my father. Lately, it had been happening more and more often. She went back into the kitchen. I said to him, "Why can't they use aircraft and bomb the submarines?" He was staring toward the kitchen and didn't hear me. I repeated it. He sighed. "Oh, yes. Same answer, Philip. There are no fighting aircraft down here. To tell you the truth, we don't have any weapons." And we're going to stop there. Great story. I hope that you will enjoy it. I think you will. Right now, like I said, we're getting a lot of background information. So I will look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow on our Zoom meeting. And hopefully all of you have picked up your materials or checked out your Google Classroom. Make sure you've done that, because everything you need, all your instructions and everything are all in that Google Classroom. So, all right, guys, I love you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.